Official case summaries. Unaltered footage. Transparent justice. You are watching Bodycam incident reports.
Let's save us both a lot of time and trouble. We both know you aren't walking to the registers with that.
Excuse me?
You can leave the merchandise right here and walk out the front doors. Or you can come with me to the back office. If you make me call the real cops, we're gonna put you in handcuffs right here in front of everybody.
Saturday, 8:15 a.m. The cavernous aisles of the suburban mega hardware store hummed with the harsh, buzzing glow of overhead fluorescent lights. The air smelled of cut pine, fertilizer, and industrial floor wax. It was the kind of massive retail space where weekend warriors and local contractors came to spend their mornings. Standing quietly in aisle 14, holding a heavy cardboard box, was Robert Lewis. At 62 years old, Robert was a solidly built black man, dressed for a weekend of hard physical labor. He wore a faded blue-plaid flannel shirt, old denim jeans stained with dried wood primer, and heavily scuffed work boots. He looked exactly like a tired handyman trying to stretch a modest paycheck. But appearances in retail can be deceiving. From Monday to Friday, Robert didn't wear flannel. He wore a heavy black robe. He was the Honorable Robert Lewis, a United States District Court judge with lifetime tenure, a man whose signature routinely sent cartel bosses and corrupt politicians to federal prison. But on Saturday mornings, he was just Robert. Woodworking was his quiet escape from the crushing, high-stakes reality of the federal bench. He stood in the power tool section, holding a professional-grade wood router, priced at $1,200. Before we get into the story, hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what city or country you're watching from today. Robert was in no rush. He adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the specs on the box. He was relaxed, completely absorbed in his hobby, and entirely unaware that he was currently being hunted. High above the brightly lit sales floor, tucked away behind a mirrored window, was the Loss Prevention Office. It was a cramped room, lit only by the blue glow of 24 security monitors. Sitting in the center of the dark room was Gary. Gary was the store's head of security, a man who wore tactical boots and a tight black polo shirt with a radio strapped to his chest. He treated a shoplifting deterrent job like an active patrol, largely because he had failed the psychological evaluation for the local police academy 3 separate times. He craved authority, and within the 4 walls of this hardware store, he acted like the ultimate commander. Gary leaned forward in his squeaky office chair, his eyes locked onto the feed from camera 4. He saw the high-value item first. The $1,200 router was a prime target for retail theft. Then, Gary grabbed the joystick and zoomed the camera in, focusing tightly on Robert's paint-stained boots and faded flannel shirt. Gary didn't see a woodworking enthusiast. He looked at the massive price tag, then looked back at the old clothes and made an immediate stubborn conclusion. A guy dressed like that wasn't here to buy a premium German power tool. He was here to steal it. Gary was convinced that Robert was either going to swap the barcode or simply make a run for the emergency fire exit. Gary didn't wait to see if Robert actually walked toward the cash registers. He didn't need to see him conceal the item. He had already made up his mind. Gary slammed his hand against the monitor console, turning off the screens. He grabbed his heavy 2-way radio, clipped it to his shoulder, and stood up. Without a word to his junior associate, Gary stepped out of the dark security office and onto the sales floor, walking with a fast, heavy stride toward aisle 14. He was ready to make a bust. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a federal felony. Robert Lewis finished reading the specifications on the back of the box. Satisfied with the horsepower rating, he carefully placed the heavy $1,200 wood router into his orange shopping cart. He pushed his glasses down the bridge of his nose, checked his watch, and began the long walk down the main center aisle toward the checkout registers at the front of the store. He was already mentally measuring the workbench space in his garage. He didn't make it past the plumbing section. Gary approached from the intersecting aisle, walking with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man looking for a fight. He didn't casually shadow Robert to see if he would actually bypass the cashiers. He didn't wait near the exit doors, which was standard legal loss prevention protocol. Gary wanted a confrontation, and he wanted it on his terms. Without slowing down, Gary stepped directly into the center of the aisle, planting his boots firmly on the polished linoleum, completely blocking Robert's path. Robert had to yank the handle of his shopping cart backward to avoid crashing the heavy metal basket directly into Gary's legs. The abrupt stop caused the heavy router box to slide forward with a loud thud. Gary didn't flinch. He immediately closed the distance, stepping aggressively around the front of the cart and invading Robert's personal space. He stood less than 12 inches from the older man, squaring his shoulders and resting his hand on the heavy two-way radio clipped to his chest. It was a classic, poorly executed intimidation tactic designed to make a shoplifter panic and confess. Robert didn't panic. He just stopped pushing the cart and looked at the man in the tight black polo shirt. "Let's save us both a lot of time and trouble," Gary said. His voice was kept low, but it was laced with a harsh, grating authority. He didn't ask if Robert needed help. He didn't ask to see a receipt. He pointed a thick finger at the heavy cardboard box in the cart. "We both know you aren't walking to the registers with that." Robert remained perfectly still. He looked down at Gary's pointing finger, then slowly brought his eyes up to meet the security guard's face. In a federal courtroom, when Judge Lewis delivered that exact heavy, unblinking stare, seasoned defense attorneys would immediately stop talking and apologize. "Excuse me?" Robert asked. His voice was a deep, calm baritone. It wasn't defensive. It was simply a demand for clarification. "Don't play dumb with me, buddy," Gary sneered, his ego immediately flaring up at the lack of submission. He leaned in closer, dropping all pretense of customer service. "I've been watching you on the cameras. You can leave the merchandise right here and walk out the front doors, or you can come with me to the back office. If you make me call the real cops, we're going to put you in handcuffs right here in front of everybody. Your choice." It was a blatant bluff. Under state law, Gary had absolutely no legal authority to detain someone who hadn't actually attempted to leave the store with unpaid merchandise. By stopping Robert in the middle of the aisle and threatening him with police action if he didn't surrender the item or follow him to a secondary location, Gary had just crossed a massive legal boundary. Robert knew this. He knew the exact state statutes regarding retail detention, false arrest, and civil rights violations. He could have dismantled Gary's entire bluff right there in the plumbing aisle. He could have loudly demanded the store manager and threatened a massive lawsuit. But Robert Lewis was a man of the law, and he despised public spectacles. He had spent his entire career maintaining order and decorum. Getting into a shouting match with an overly aggressive mall cop near the PVC pipes was entirely beneath him. Furthermore, Robert's analytical mind was already cataloging Gary's actions: the threat, the physical blocking of his path, the coercion. Robert didn't argue. He didn't try to explain that he was simply on his way to pay. He gave Gary one last, long, evaluating look. "Lead the way," Robert said quietly. He let go of the shopping cart handle, leaving the expensive router behind in the aisle. Gary smirked, visibly swelling with pride. He had won. He had successfully intimidated the suspect without even needing to use physical force. "Smart move," Gary muttered, turning around and gesturing for Robert to follow him toward the heavy double doors at the back of the store. Gary thought he was escorting a defeated petty thief into an interrogation room. He was entirely unaware that he was actually leading a sitting United States federal judge into a locked room, methodically building the perfect criminal case against himself. Gary led the way through a set of heavy gray double doors marked "Employees Only." The bright, buzzing fluorescent lights of the retail floor were instantly replaced by the dim, yellowed lighting of the store's back corridors. Robert followed in complete silence, his heavy work boots thudding softly against the concrete floor. They arrived at a solid wooden door with a keypad lock. Gary punched in a 4-digit code, the electronic mechanism clicked, and he pushed the door open, gesturing for Robert to step inside. It was the loss prevention office. The room was no larger than a walk-in closet. There were no windows. The air was stale, smelling faintly of cheap coffee and the ozone from the humming server rack in the corner. The walls were plastered with faded corporate policy posters and grainy printouts of known shoplifters. In the center of the cramped space sat a cheap laminate desk and 2 folding chairs. It was an environment specifically designed to make a suspect feel isolated, small, and entirely at the mercy of the store's security. Gary walked around the desk and took the larger padded office chair. He didn't offer Robert a seat. He wanted the older man standing, physically looking down at the paperwork he was about to weaponize. Gary opened a desk drawer and pulled out a clipboard. He slapped it down onto the laminate surface with a sharp, practiced smack. Clipped to the board was a standard civil demand notice, a legally dubious piece of corporate boilerplate used by major retailers. It was essentially a confession form that allowed the store to extort a massive fine from a suspected shoplifter in exchange for not calling the police. Gary clicked a cheap ballpoint pen and tossed it onto the clipboard. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head, thoroughly enjoying the power dynamic he had manufactured. "Here's how this works," Gary began, using the rehearsed, monotonous tone of a cop reading Miranda rights. "You're going to give me your driver's license. I'm going to make a photocopy for our trespass database. Then, you're going to sign the bottom of that form acknowledging that you attempted to bypass the point of sale with unpaid merchandise. You pay the store a $200 civil penalty, you never come back, and I let you walk out of here without a criminal record." Gary paused, waiting for the gratitude or the panicked excuses. Robert Lewis just looked at the clipboard. Then, he looked at Gary. He didn't reach for the pen. He didn't ask to read the fine print. "My identification," Robert stated, his voice a low, perfectly even baritone. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, your ID." "Right now," Gary snapped, irritated that the older man wasn't playing his assigned role of the frightened thief. Robert reached into the back pocket of his paint-stained jeans. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of fear. He pulled out a worn, dark brown leather wallet. He didn't fumble with it. He flipped it open and, instead of handing over a plastic state driver's license, he placed the entire wallet flat on the center of the desk, right next to the extortion paperwork. Gary leaned forward, letting his chair drop with a thud. He looked down. Embedded in the leather was a heavy, intricate, solid, gold-toned shield. It caught the dim light of the office, gleaming with an undeniable, heavy authority. Deeply engraved into the center of the metal was the Great Seal of the United States. Directly below the badge, securely housed behind a thick plastic window, was a secure federal identification card bearing a government barcode, a photograph of Robert, and bold black lettering that commanded absolute silence. The Honorable Robert Lewis, United States District Judge. Gary stopped breathing. The hum of the server rack in the corner suddenly sounded deafening. He stared at the gold seal, his brain violently struggling to process the conflicting data. The man standing in front of him wasn't a retired handyman. He wasn't a petty shoplifter. He was a sitting federal judge, a man wielding the highest tier of judicial power in the country, currently wearing faded flannel and dirty boots. Gary had just pulled a federal official out of a public space under the threat of arrest and demanded a forced confession. A smart man would have recognized the catastrophic legal gravity of the situation instantly. But Gary's ego was about to write a check his future couldn't cash. For 5 agonizing seconds, the cramped loss prevention office was dead silent. Gary stared down at the heavy gold seal of the United States District Court. His brain misfired, violently rejecting the reality of the credentials sitting on his cheap laminate desk. The cognitive dissonance was simply too great for his ego to process. A man who held the power to sentence federal criminals did not spend his Saturday mornings wearing a faded flannel shirt and boots stained with wood primer. A rational human being, even a terrible security guard, would have immediately recognized the gravity of the mistake. They would have apologized, handed the wallet back with trembling hands, and opened the door. Gary was not a rational human being. He was a man who had failed every psychological evaluation for law enforcement because of his inability to de-escalate. Gary's face flushed a deep mottled red, his jaw clenched tight. Instead of backing down, his bruised pride demanded that he assert control over the situation. He reached out and aggressively flicked the leather wallet with his index finger, sliding it across the desk toward Robert. "A federal judge!" Gary scoffed, his voice dripping with venom and forced amusement. He let out a harsh, unnatural laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Right? And I'm the director of the FBI. You guys are getting really creative, I'll give you that. Did you buy that off Amazon, or did you print it in your basement?" Robert Lewis didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice to defend his honor. He didn't reach for his wallet. He simply watched Gary with the cold, clinical detachment of an apex predator observing a cornered animal making its final mistake. "I strongly suggest you look closer at that identification," Robert said. His voice was a flat, unyielding monotone. It wasn't a threat. It was a genuine legal warning. "I don't need to look at anything, buddy," Gary snapped. The veins in his thick neck bulged. The polite bureaucratic facade he had used earlier was completely gone, replaced by raw, unchecked aggression. He slammed his palms flat on the desk, pushing himself up out of his chair. Gary walked around the desk, deliberately invading Robert's personal space once again. But Robert didn't step back. He held his ground, forcing Gary to break eye contact first. Gary turned away in frustration and marched directly to the heavy, windowless wooden door they had just walked through. Gary grabbed the heavy brass deadbolt above the handle. He turned it hard to the right. Clack! The sharp metallic sound of the heavy deadbolt locking into the door frame echoed loudly in the small, concrete-walled room. It was a small, simple physical action, but in the eyes of the law, that single clack fundamentally altered the universe. By locking the door and physically preventing Robert from leaving, Gary was no longer just a terrible employee making a bad stop. He had just committed false imprisonment, and because he had locked a sitting United States District Court judge in a windowless room against his will, he had just triggered a cascade of federal felony statutes. Gary turned back around, crossing his thick arms over his chest, standing directly in front of the locked door like a bouncer. He gestured sharply toward the clipboard on the desk with his chin. "You're not walking out of this room until your signature is on that confession," Gary commanded, completely oblivious to the legal trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. "You want to play dress-up with fake badges? Fine. Let's see how the real cops like it when I call them down here for fraud and shoplifting. Sign the paper." Robert Lewis looked at the locked deadbolt. Then he looked at Gary. The judge's expression remained entirely unchanged. He had just been handed the perfect, irrefutable elements of a crime. He didn't need to argue anymore. "As you wish," Robert said softly. He didn't reach for the pen. Instead, Robert calmly reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out his cell phone. Robert Lewis didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand to be released. Standing calmly in the cramped, locked loss prevention office, he bypassed the lock screen on his cell phone and dialed a local number. He held the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving the security guard leaning smugly against the dead-bolted door. "Dispatch, what is your emergency?" The operator's voice leaked faintly through the phone's earpiece. "This is United States District Court Judge Robert Lewis," Robert said. His baritone voice was steady, projecting the exact same unshakable authority he used from the bench. "I am currently being unlawfully detained and held against my will inside the security office of the hardware store on West Ridge Road. I need patrol units dispatched." "I am in no immediate physical danger, but the individual has locked the deadbolt from the inside. Gary let out a loud, theatrical sigh, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, thoroughly unimpressed. "Wow," Gary mocked, shaking his head. "Give your buddy on the other end of the line an Oscar for that one. You really think I'm going to fall for the fake phone call routine? You're not leaving until you sign the civil demand." "I will remain on the line until officers arrive," Robert told the dispatcher, completely ignoring Gary's taunts. He lowered the phone slightly and simply stood there, perfectly still. The next 6 minutes were agonizingly silent. Gary tried to stare Robert down, trying to assert dominance, but the older man's cold, unblinking gaze felt like a physical weight. Gary shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. His smug smile began to falter, just a fraction. A tiny seed of doubt planting itself in the back of his mind. What if he wasn't faking? Suddenly 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled the wooden door. "Police department! Open the door!" A gruff voice echoed from the hallway. Gary's smile instantly returned, wider than before. He looked at Robert with absolute triumph. "Showtime, buddy! Let's see how much the real cops like your fake badge." Gary turned around, flipped the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy door open. 2 veteran local patrol officers stood in the hallway, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. "Hey, guys," Gary greeted them warmly, stepping aside to let them into the cramped room. He pointed a thick finger at Robert. "Got a live one for you today. Tried to walk out with a $1,200 router. When I brought him back here to sign the paperwork, he started waving a fake federal ID and pretending to call dispatch." Gary reached down to the desk, picked up the leather wallet containing the gold shield, and shoved it toward the chest of the lead patrolman. "Look at this garbage. Tried to tell me he was a federal judge." Officer Davis, a 15-year veteran of the force, took the wallet. He looked down at the heavy gold seal of the United States. He looked at the secure identification card. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked past Gary, locking eyes with the black man standing quietly in the corner, wearing a faded flannel shirt. Officer Davis instantly stopped breathing, the color completely drained from his face. Just 3 days prior, Officer Davis had sat in a federal courtroom to testify in a massive racketeering case. He knew exactly what the man who presided over that courtroom looked like. "Judge Lewis?" Officer Davis whispered, the sheer horror in his voice completely betraying Gary's narrative. Gary frowned, looking back and forth between the cop and Robert. "What? No, Davis, it's a fake. The guy is a—" "Shut your mouth, Gary," Officer Davis barked, his voice cracking with panic. He aggressively shoved Gary backward, pinning the security guard against the wall. The second officer instantly unclipped his handcuffs, reacting to his partner's sudden shift in demeanor. "Gary, are you out of your mind?" Davis yelled, grabbing the security guard by the collar of his tight black polo shirt. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Gary's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. His brain finally caught up to reality. The heavy silence of the room crashed down on him. His eyes darted to the gold shield in the officer's hand, then to the imposing figure of Robert Lewis, who hadn't moved a single inch. "Your Honor," Officer Davis stammered, instantly turning back to Robert, his posture rigid with respect. "Are you all right? Did he put his hands on you?" "I am unharmed, officer," Robert replied smoothly. He stepped forward, calmly taking his leather wallet back from Davis's trembling hand and slipping it into his jeans. He looked directly at Gary, who was now pinned to the wall, hyperventilating as the second officer yanked his arms behind his back. "However," Robert continued, his voice echoing in the small room like a gavel striking a sounding block, "this individual physically blocked my exit from a public aisle, coerced me into this secondary location under threat of false arrest, and intentionally locked the deadbolt on that door to prevent me from leaving." The sharp click-click of ratcheting steel handcuffs echoed in the room as they clamped down tight on Gary's wrists. Officers, I believe you have clear probable cause for felony false imprisonment, Robert stated calmly. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply delivered the legal reality. I will contact the district attorney's office to provide my formal statement this afternoon. Have a good weekend, Gary. Robert Lewis adjusted his glasses, walked past the paralyzed handcuffed security guard, and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, leaving Gary entirely alone in the dark to face the crushing consequences of his own ego. Talk about the ultimate reality check. Do you guys think Gary deserves actual prison time for locking that door? Or was he just a guy doing his job really, really badly? Drop your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If you love seeing arrogant people get a massive dose of instant karma, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next video on your screen right now. Stay safe out there.
Report officially finalized. To ensure you see future transparent records, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching Bodycam Incident Reports.